Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. And today we're diving into something that I think a lot of people probably remember hearing about. But we're going to go a little bit deeper than the headlines this time. And that is the U.S. withdrawal from WHO,
Right.
the World Health Organization.
Yes.
And this is one of those topics where I think no matter where you're coming from, whether you are, really into global health or you're fascinated by international relations, or you just kind of want to understand, like, why was this such a big deal? This is a deep dive that should have something for you.
Yeah, definitely.
And the big question that we are going to try to tackle today is, what were the forces behind this decision?
Right.
And how is this impacting, global health and, international relations?
Yeah, what's so interesting about this is that it wasn't just a policy tweak. This is a major power move with global consequences that I think we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, and when we were going through the sources on this one, one of the things that came up again and again was this idea of America First nationalism as being like a driving force behind the decision.
Yeah.
But I think to really understand that, we have to kind of go beyond the slogan.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
I mean, if you look at other moves that were made under the same administration, like the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement,
Right.
you start to see that this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
It really suggests a broader shift in how the U.S. was viewing its place in the world.
So it's like moving away from multilateralism.
Yeah.
This idea that like nations work together to solve problems.
Exactly.
But there's more to it than that, right?
Right, because layered on top of that America First idea, you had growing tensions with China.
Right.
And the Trump administration very publicly criticized the WHO's response to COVID-19, even going so far as to accuse them of being too influenced by China.
Wow. So it's like a moment where you would think that global unity would be like super important because of a pandemic.
Right.
But it actually ended up fueling these rivalries.
Right, exactly.
So how did that actually play out like within the WHO?
Well, the Trump administration argued that the WHO wasn't tough enough on China in those crucial early days of the pandemic.
Yeah.
They claimed that the organization wasn't transparent enough and might have even downplayed the severity of the outbreak.
Right.
Now, of course, just one perspective on the situation.
All right.
We're not saying it's the only one.
And that's an important point to make. Like, we are presenting different viewpoints here.
Right.
Not necessarily endorsing any of them.
Exactly.
But it sounds like this wasn't just about like global politics.
Oh, no.
Domestic politics had a role to play here too, right?
Absolutely, because the decision to withdraw from the WHO really resonated with a segment of the population in the U.S. that was already skeptical of international organizations.
Right.
And the idea of, sending U.S. dollars overseas.
Right.
So it kind of played into a narrative that was already circulating.
Okay, so we've got like these three major threads here, right?
Yeah.
You've got like America First nationalism, you've got tensions with China, and then you've got this like domestic political calculation happening.
Right.
It's like a tangled knot, and it's hard to say which strand is actually pulling the most weight.
It's definitely a complex mix.
Yeah.
And I think, trying to figure out the precise weight of each factor is still something that historians and political scientists are debating.
Right.
But recognizing these different forces, I think, can help us to understand the context of the decision a bit better.
Yeah, because understanding the why, I think, is really important.
Right.
Figuring out the impact.
Absolutely.
And one of the most immediate consequences of this decision was the financial fallout.
Yeah.
The U.S. was the WHO's biggest financial contributor.
Right.
So what did that actually look like in practical terms?
Well, imagine you're running this global health organization, right? Your mission is to combat diseases, to prepare for pandemics, and then suddenly you lose 13% of your budget.
Overnight.
Overnight.
Yeah.
That's a huge blow, and it means you're going to have to make some really tough choices.
Yeah, and it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right.
It's about real programs on the ground, right?
Exactly.
Our sources mention things like polio, malaria, HIV/AIDS programs that most people have at least heard of and know are like serious threats.
Right.
Were those programs affected?
Well, the potential was definitely there. I mean, when you have a funding gap, that big cuts have to be made somewhere.
Yeah.
And those cuts could mean things like, scaling back vaccination campaigns, reducing access to life-saving medications, or even halting research into new treatments.
Yeah, that's scary. And it's not just a theoretical impact. It's about, people's health
Right.
and well-being in
Absolutely.
every corner of the world.
Yeah.
And speaking of global impact, wasn't there also concern about pandemic preparedness?
Oh, absolutely, because the WHO is really on the front lines of global health security.
Right.
I mean, they're the ones tracking outbreaks. They coordinate responses, and they help countries build the capacity to handle these health emergencies.
Right.
So taking away a significant chunk of their funding is kind of like trying to fight a fire with one hand tied behind your back.
Yeah, it makes it a lot harder for sure.
Yeah,
So we're seeing how the financial fallout here goes beyond just like the numbers.
right.
But the WHO's role in global health is much bigger than just the money, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, think of them as like the central nervous system of global health.
Yeah.
They set international standards, they lead research efforts, and they coordinate those responses to outbreaks.
Right.
So when that system is disrupted, the consequences can be felt everywhere.
So what happens when that central nervous system is weakened?
Right.
What were some of the concerns that were outlined in our sources?
One of the big fears was a resurgence of diseases that were previously under control.
Right.
So imagine outbreaks of measles or polio becoming more common because vaccination programs have been scaled back.
Yeah, that would be like a huge step backwards.
Exactly.
It's not just about responding to existing threats, but also about preventing new ones.
Right.
Did the sources point to any specific examples of programs that were like particularly vulnerable?
Yeah. COVAX is a great example.
Okay.
This was a global effort to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines.
Right.
And the U.S. played a key role in that.
Right.
So the withdrawal raised concerns about, disrupting that initiative and jeopardizing vaccine distribution, especially in low-income countries.
So it's like this ripple effect.
Right.
Funding cuts lead to weakened programs,
Yeah.
and then that impacts global health security.
Exactly.
But our sources also point to another layer here, and that's the geopolitical fallout.
Right.
You mentioned tensions with China earlier.
Right.
How did the U.S. withdrawal change the power dynamics within the WHO?
That's one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole thing.
Okay.
Because with the U.S. stepping back, there was this vacuum. And whenever you have a power vacuum, someone's going to try to fill it.
Of course.
And China, being this rising power with its own global health ambitions, was seen as a potential contender for that space.
So it's like a realignment of global power almost,
Exactly.
where the absence of one major player can create this domino effect.
Right, and that's what made the situation so complex.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just about the U.S. and the WHO.
Right.
It was about this shifting balance of power on the global stage and how that might reshape the future of global health governance.
So we've got this like tangled web.
Yeah.
You have the decision itself.
Yeah.
You have the immediate consequences.
Yeah.
And then you have these potential ripple effects that could really reshape the global health landscape.
Yeah.
What were some of the possible future scenarios that our sources outlined?
Right.
What might happen next?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. eventually rejoins the WHO, perhaps under a new administration with different priorities.
Right.
We've seen that happen before in other international agreements.
So a potential return to the table,
Right.
but maybe not a complete reset to how things were before?
Right.
Did the sources explore any other potential scenarios besides just a straight-up return?
Yeah, because even if the U.S. decided to come back to the table, it wouldn't be like hitting a rewind button.
Right,
There
exactly.
would be, some baggage, some trust to rebuild.
Yeah.
Did the sources discuss any other scenarios besides just like a straight-up return?
Yeah, they did. Another possibility they brought up was the U.S. rejoining, but with conditions.
Okay.
So it's like coming back to the negotiating table, but wanting to kind of redefine the relationship.
So not just rejoining, but rejoining with like a list of demands.
Right, yeah. Maybe demanding certain reforms within the WHO,
Okay.
a greater financial transparency, or changes to how decisions are made.
So what kind of reforms were they talking about specifically?
Well, one area that they mentioned was the WHO's relationship with China.
So there might be calls for, more scrutiny of China's influence within the organization, or even changes to the voting structure to try and balance things out a little bit.
Right. It's almost like a delicate dance
Right.
where you're trying to assert your interests
Yeah.
without alienating everyone else who's sitting at the
Yeah.
table with you.
Yeah. And those kinds of demands, could definitely ruffle some feathers.
Yeah, for sure. But even with all of those potential hurdles, rejoining, even with conditions, seems like it would be at least a step in the right direction.
Right.
Did the sources consider any scenarios where the U.S. just stayed out of the WHO entirely?
They did. And that's where things get really interesting. And I think potentially worrying.
Okay.
One scenario that they explored was continued withdrawal.
Okay.
So the U.S. just staying out of the WHO for the foreseeable future.
Right.
Just think about the implications of that.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down. I mean, we've already talked about like the immediate impact, right? The funding gaps, the weakened pandemic preparedness, the potential setbacks in fighting diseases like polio and malaria.
All right.
But what would continued withdrawal mean in the long term?
Well, one concern is that you would see kind of a fragmentation of global health governance.
Okay.
So instead of having one strong global health organization coordinating efforts, you'd have different countries or regions going their own way.
So instead of a united front against these global health threats,
Right.
it's like a patchwork of different approaches,
Exactly.
potentially working at cross purposes.
Yeah, and that could make things a lot more complicated.
Yeah. So how would that actually look like, play out in practice?
Well, you could have different regions setting their own standards for things like travel restrictions
Okay.
or disease surveillance.
Right.
Even treatment protocols could vary from place to place.
Right.
So coordination would become much more difficult and information sharing might slow down.
It wouldn't be impossible to manage,
Right.
but it would definitely be a lot less efficient.
Yeah. It's like trying to solve a global problem with a bunch of local solutions.
Right. And beyond those practical challenges, wouldn't there also be some symbolic implications?
No, for sure.
What message would a continued U.S. withdrawal send to the rest of the world?
Well, the U.S. has historically played a really significant role in shaping global health policy.
Right.
So stepping back from that could be seen as a sign of declining American leadership on the world stage.
So it's not just about the WHO itself.
Right.
It's about the U.S.'s role in this broader system of global cooperation.
Exactly.
Did the sources explore any potential consequences for the U.S. specifically?
Yeah.
Could there actually be a downside to going it alone?
Oh, absolutely, because they emphasized how interconnected global health really is.
Right.
When you think about the COVID-19 pandemic,
Yeah.
it showed us that viruses don't respect borders.
Definitely not.
So even if the U.S. tried to isolate itself, it wouldn't be immune to health threats that emerge elsewhere.
It's a good point. The world is more interconnected now than ever. And that applies to health threats.
Yeah.
Just as much as it does to things like trade or communication.
Exactly.
So even from a purely self-interested perspective, the U.S. still has a stake
Yeah.
in a strong global health system.
Absolutely.
So we've explored these three potential scenarios.
Right.
Outright rejoining with conditions and continued withdrawal.
Yeah.
And it seems like each path has its own set of challenges and potential consequences.
Right.
What stood out to you as like the most important takeaway from all of this?
You know what really struck me was the interconnectedness of it all.
Okay.
The decision to withdraw from the WHO wasn't just about health policy.
Right.
It was about geopolitics. It was about domestic politics.
Right.
And ultimately, it was about the U.S.'s role in the world.
That's a great point. It really highlights how these spheres that we often think of as being separate are actually really deeply intertwined.
Absolutely.
But beyond that broad observation, what do you think this all means for us, the listeners? Why should we care about, the inner workings of the WHO or the intricacies of U.S. foreign policy? It's easy to feel like these are such huge global issues,
Right.
that they're kind of beyond our control.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing from you is that understanding these connections, these ripple effects,
Right.
that's where our power lies.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Right.
And when you understand the forces that are shaping these events, you're better equipped to engage in, meaningful conversations.
Right.
Advocate for solutions and hold your leaders accountable.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that these decisions that are made, kind of on this global stage,
Right.
actually have very real, very local consequences.
Exactly.
So it's not just about the U.S. and the WHO. This has implications for everyone, no matter where you live.
Right. Because global health security, as we've seen, is interconnected.
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world can and often does affect us all.
It's like that old saying, no man is an island. And that brings us to, I think, a really important question that our sources raise.
Yeah.
And that is, in an increasingly interconnected world,
Right.
facing all of these global health challenges,
Yeah.
can any nation truly afford to go it alone?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
It really is. And it makes you think about your own country's role in all of this.
Absolutely.
What part does your nation play in global health governance? Are they a leader? Are they a follower? Are they somewhere in between?
That's an excellent question for every listener to consider.
Yeah.
Because Understanding your own country's role,
Mm-hmm.
their strengths, their weaknesses, can help you to become a more informed and engaged citizen.
Right. And I think that's what's been so eye-opening for me in this deep dive is that global health isn't just about
Yeah.
these abstract policies or these distant institutions.
Right.
It's about real people, real lives,
Absolutely.
our shared future.
Our shared future, exactly.
Well, this has been, I think, an incredible deep dive.
That's been great.
We've unpacked the decision.
Uh-huh.
We've explored the consequences.
Right.
And we've even looked ahead to these potential future scenarios.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to process,
Yeah.
but hopefully it's given everyone listening a new perspective
Right.
on just how complex these issues are
Yeah.
and, the U.S.'s role in it all.
And I would encourage everyone, you know, keep digging deeper.
Yeah,
Do some research, explore different viewpoints, and challenge your own assumptions.
right.
Because the more we understand these issues, the better equipped we'll be to really create a healthier and more equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious.